I'm going to solidify the title that has been given to me as the Featherweight Guru. With the bare bones of the gun weighing 5 pounds and the entire base package costing less than $200 depending on where you get it and when you get it, it's a no-brainer that the demographic of customers that are going to buy this are one of the following. Kids on tight budgets, adults on tight budgets, kids that just want an M249 that they can carry, adults that have carried real M249s and they know better. But then once you actually get your hands on one of these and try to field it, you start to see the unfortunate side effects of getting such a cheap gun. A lot of the times, they just don't really work out of the box. They're really screechy, whiny, they don't really hop BBs that well, they kind of shoot like shit. And the stock AEG platform of these builds, it's not really conducive to you just swapping a motor out, or just changing the bucking, really. I mean, the parts in here are very lackluster, but there's hope. But as it turns out, that hope comes in the form of you spending more money to upgrade this gun than what you spent on the gun, which is like kind of yin and yang. On one hand, it's a pretty cheap gun, so it's not that hard to spend more than what the base gun costs to upgrade the base gun. But on the other hand, it's going to completely crush your fake expectations that you can get a working LMG for under $200. It's just never going to happen in Airsoft. And as it also turns out, I'm going to say something that I should really never say as a tech, but there's kind of only one way to really build featherweights out to make them shoot good. You have some leeway in some areas, and we'll go over that, but like, you can't get too creative with these without doing a lot of work that, frankly, a lot of people don't want to pay for. Doing a full AEG upgrade project on a featherweight is a little bit uncertain. You might think, oh, there's just a version 2 gearbox in it. It's just like building out an M4, but it's not really the case. There's a couple things in the featherweight that will present some challenges that you're not going to see in an M4, such as motor alignment, grip, gearbox alignment, nozzle alignment, and the super long nozzle, and keeping that thing aligned, and mid-cap syndrome. Which kind of leads into the first thing that I see everybody mess up when they're doing featherweights. They are, for some reason, changing the stock gearbox shell. Again, for some reason. Now, if you're doing an AEG build and you want a super reliable support weapon, it makes sense to put a retro arms in there. Until you find out that in the featherweight, the only thing that's ensuring that your gearbox shell is aligned is the tiny pin, which you'll see in M4s, and a shelf inside the receiver that is going to prevent the gearbox shell from tilting backwards, and the grip. Yeah, that grip has to be fully seated to the receiver with the dimensions of the stock gearbox shell to ensure that these 3 main points of contact are keeping that shell horizontal to the ground so that you know that you'll have good gearbox shell alignment with your hop-up and barrel assembly, which is kind of a loose fit. And this isn't just something I've seen with AEG builds, I've also seen it happen with HPA builds. For some reason I've seen featherweights come in here with HPA engines in them and they're not using the stock shell. There's kind of a hidden implicit rule of thumb when doing HPA builds to like try to keep the stock gearbox shell that was in that build, because it's just gonna further increase the odds that everything will stay aligned. You want to keep the stock gearbox shell in the featherweight. Otherwise, you're going to be doing a lot of crafty MacGyver type mods to the receiver to make whatever aftermarket option you chose fit. And it might not be worth your time, and it's probably not going to be worth your customer's money. So then if you know at this point, if you trust me when I tell you that you should use the stock gearbox shell, then your options are, all right, do we want to use this stock cast metal shell for an AEG build for a support weapon that's going to be firing full auto constantly? The answer is maybe. I haven't really seen these things get pushed to the limit. Most of the time, people just want to HPA these. Nobody's really come to me to do an AEG build of one of these. I'm up for the challenge. I'm cool with doing that. But so far, I've only been doing HPA builds on these. Okay, so we're gonna do HPA. What engine do I use? What about the jack? The Polar Star jack is like a really affordable engine. It kind of makes sense to use it with this really affordable gun. Don't do it. Do not use a jack. Every single, without fail, every single featherweight I've ever seen with a jack installed in it was having serious issues where BBs were just always hooking to one side, regardless what hop-up barrel assembly was used. Does not matter. And I have some theories as to why that is. The jack uses plastic nozzles, and the featherweight nozzle is pretty long. So you have a long plastic nozzle with BBs feeding up from a diagonal direction on the bottom. I'm pretty sure that that's enough to make that nozzle flex out of the way, cause some really bad nozzle misalignment in super hyper speed as everything's shooting and functioning. And the direction that the nozzle is getting pushed kind of corresponds with the direction that the BBs are hooking to the side when it's shooting. So I've never seen one work, and honestly, if I'm doing an LMG, I'd rather have dual solenoids. So my go-to is to use a Polar Star F2 with a number 14 nozzle. I also really recommend that you get your number 14 nozzle directly from Polar Star, mainly because if you look at the chart that Polar Star makes to correspond the different nozzles that they have to specific lengths and specific brands and models, you'll find that if you get a number 14 from them, that number 14 will correspond with their chart. Now, before you get all worked up and start typing in the comments because you know better, I'm not saying the jack is a bad engine, and I'm also not saying that like a Wolverine Inferno is a bad option. That's not really the point of the video. I'm showing you what I like to do. But I think a dual solenoid engine is definitely a good choice for an LMG, just because of the independence in tuning that you have between your nozzle and the air coming out of the engine. It really helps you fine-tune different types of box mags that you might be using for that LMG build. So where are we at so far? Obviously we have the main externals of the gun. We are sticking with the stock gearbox shell. I believe somebody at this point has made other outer barrels for the featherweight. I would not discourage doing that. The weight of the stock outer barrel for the featherweight weighs more than the outer barrel for the full weight M249s. Neat little factoid there. As long as they get this whole trunnion portion correct, then there really shouldn't be an issue using an aftermarket outer barrel. But for simplicity's sake, let's just say we're going to stick with the stock outer barrel. All right, the feed block. Here's my shameless self-promotion here. All right, this is the paid ad of this video. AntTech Airsoft Studios. I'm dying. Over at AntTechAirsoft.com, I sell the AntTech improved feed block for the S&D Cybergun Featherweight M249. This just simply replaces the original feed block, and you'll find that when you use this feed block, all of a sudden, even shitty mags tend to feed pretty well in your featherweight, where they did not feed that well before. This video is not really an ad for the feed block. I have a whole video install guide on that, where you can watch it if you're interested in buying that. Aside from the feed block, the next main thing is you gotta get rid of this whole hop-up barrel assembly. These stock hop-ups are honestly not great. They almost always look like somebody took a box cutter and tried to remount the hole, and that's just out of the factory. The stock barrel works, I guess, but once you start replacing this stuff, you might as well change the barrel. And the stock bucking is just like the stock bucking in most stock airsoft guns. They're just meh, or they just don't work at all. So for the hop-up, we have one of two options, really. There's the EPES hop-up chamber for the featherweight, which I don't really like because they don't fix the whole arm and nub situation. They're still taking the cylindrical nub and orienting it like this, so that it doesn't really do a good job. So the Bull Gear Featherweight hop-up chamber, honestly, is the best bet. If you have my feed block, then you could also get away with using the traditional A&K classic Army spec hop-up chamber, which I would also recommend the Bull Gear version of that, if that's all you can get your hands on. But that's not necessarily a drop-in solution. Once you go that route, watch that install guide for the feed block if you want to know more about that. The Bull Gear Featherweight hop-up chamber it's kind of the bee's knees. Now, with that said, these are really picky with which bucking you choose to use in these. And this is where we start to talk about how there's only really one way to build these. You do have some options with here, and the options tend to be increasing by the month as new products start to get released. We'll talk about this for sure. At that point, you have to ask yourself, what kind of magazine am I going to be running in this? Do I just want to run a bunch of mid-caps, or do I want a box mag? If so, what kind of box mag do I want? So I'll show you the option that I like to run with. I like to use the Bull Gear Kit Mag, and they now make one that is compatible specifically with the SNT Cybergun Featherweights. I made a video not too long ago kind of giving a whole rundown on how to set up these kit box mags, as far as how to power them, or how to power the gun with the battery in the box mag, all the little connectors and stuff. That's a very informative video for anybody wondering. I'm going to show you guys how I like to do it with these 3 featherweights, because they're all running the same exact setup in that regard. And lastly, it's just bells and whistles and furniture and custom mods in that regard, and tuning. Going this approach with the parts is great, but if you don't install them right, there's really no point. So that's the main, meat and potatoes of this video. I'm going to be showing you how I install these engines, how I do the hop-up barrel assemblies, how I fine-tune the box mags, and because I'm doing this to 3 featherweights, you'll see how repeatable it is, and you'll see how the little tolerances that I'm tuning might have some variation between 3 identical setups. Stock internal hardware that's crucial to keep. It's going to be the gearbox shell, as we discussed. The trigger, because you don't really have any other options in that front. Keep all the screws for the gearbox shell. Keep all 4 screws for the motor grip. You need these 3 screws for the feed block. Stock pins. The middle body pin, do not lose this. And then, for HPA's sake, we're absolutely keeping the little screw to hold that trigger board down. As I mentioned before, we're doing 3 featherweights. This is something that's going to be identical across the 3 of them. We have some PDI 605 inner barrels. These are R-hopped using Elvish tack patches. Now, you don't have to R-hop these. I like to R-hop them. And if you're going to use a PDI barrel or a Lambda barrel, these are barrels that have shorter length windows generally. It's going to work pretty well with the window cutout. So what I mean by that is, if you were to use a window that was much longer on something, say like a ZCI or an EDGI, and you R-hop that, you're not going to be able to use all of that surface area of the R-hop patch with the small window cutout in the hop-up chamber and the nubs that'll fit in there. So these R-hopped barrels tend to work really well. And if you wanted to not R-hop it, there are some other buckings that will fit and work pretty well in this hop-up chamber. Bull Gear recommends a Prometheus Purple. If you're doing an LMG, I really don't recommend this if we're talking about the contact mound. It's a traditional mound. It's a fairly soft bucking, and you are going to rip through that pretty quick. It's not going to last very long. However, as far as lip retention and lip length, this bucking does a good job, but again, still a soft bucking. While they'll fit, I don't see these last as long as the other options I'm going to show you. A Mad Bull Blue bucking, slightly harder, still kind of weak as far as the contact mound, but again, good lip length and good lip retention. Generally, I've seen this be the case across many repeated instances of using these buckings in these hop-up chambers. And then the EMG Atlas, which is just a Mad Bull Blue bucking that's pre-flattened and is teal. So lip retention, lip length, it's all going to be there. And this being pre-flattened makes it a lot easier. You don't have to modify the bucking when you're pairing it with an R-hop. Then we have our all-in-ones. The True Hop Gen 3 and the 4UAD, I have not found an instance where these don't work. in the bull gear hop-up chambers. Now, keep in mind that the inner barrel that you use is going to have some influence over what buckings work the best. And it has to do with the way that this inner barrel fits inside of this chamber and the way that the inner barrel is fixed into place. These hop-up chambers use an O-ring that slides over the inner barrel and rests inside these notches. And you'll see the notch inside the chamber for the O-ring. And it comes with 2 different sized O-rings, and that's done so that you can use the appropriate one to ensure that when you have your bucking and you have this all installed and you close the other half, the 2 different O-rings let you pick one that is not going to allow this inner barrel to shift back and forth inside the hop-up chamber. If it's shifting back and forth, then it's going to result in crazy issues like inaccuracy, FPS deviation. Not good. So I'm going to show you how I kind of expect this all to fit when it's put together. Always use some lube when doing barrel assemblies. You want some lube on the inner barrel where the bucking will slide over. And you want some lube on the bucking. What I'm using for this is Super Lube silicone grease. Let's start with this smaller O-ring. Now, as it stands right now, this inner barrel is able to slide back and forth. That's not very good. Now, this can change when I close this, but my prediction is that it won't. What I've had to do with the most recent batch of these hop-up chambers is I've had to kind of squeeze 2 O-rings in there to make sure that nothing moves. This is still able to move inside of the hop-up chamber. That's no good. If you have that happening, and then you email me to tell me that you're having issues with the gun ever since you installed the bundle kit I sell, the first thing I'm going to ask you is what inner barrel are you using, what bucking are you using, and did you watch Bull Gear's install guide on using these hop-up chambers? So having the right parts is not always going to be enough. It's nice when you don't have to think in order to install things and have it work, but unfortunately, should is not what is. And I like to deal with reality, because the end result is that we have a saw that works, and works well. We're trying the other O-ring, and we're going to see if this other O-ring is enough. It's a little bit skinnier, and it's a larger diameter, and I can tell that that guy is wobbling around. The idea is that when this is clamped shut, it's going to squish the O-ring, but I don't think that's going to happen with this one. Now, what does it look like for the bucking? You can see that now the bucking can get pushed out further, and I can pull it back. This will have some implications as far as your air seal between your nozzle and bucking. So now we're going to cram both of these O-rings on here. And this is like a little bit risky. This is one way you can kind of damage your hop-up chamber if you're not careful, because you are going to have to force this thing shut when you're torquing those screws down. Because obviously this guy does not want to rest and fully seat because these O-rings are in the way. But the idea is that the O-rings are squishy. We're going to have to squish them out of the way. And you're going to want to make sure that these two halves are flush with one another. And this is the part where I see people strip out the screws or just completely snap the screws by over-torquing them. And then they turned a functioning hop-up into a paperweight that can't really be worked with all too much. So this is where we're going to be very careful with how we go about this. It's also very important that we get these two halves flush, because that's going to help maintain that air seal on the sleeve of the bucking, so that air does not escape in places where it shouldn't be escaping. It's much easier now, though, that they're using torque screws as opposed to the hex screws that they used to use. So now that's clamped down. And this inner barrel is now not going to budge. The inner barrel is fixed inside this hop-up chamber. That's a very good thing. I can kind of play around with the bucking that's exposed here. Look down the barrel. And I can see what we're looking like as far as where the contact patch needs to be to push the bucking down the right way. But we're looking pretty good so far. Now notice that this bucking is sticking out a little bit. That's not a huge problem. It's only a problem if it's so long that it prevents a BB from getting in there. And when you test this, you always want to roll the BB in as gently as possible, because you don't want any gravity assistance to be skewing what it is you're checking for here. You want to make sure in the scenario in which all you're trying to do is push the BB through with minimal force that the bucking lip is not stopping it. And that doesn't seem to be the case. Now we have lip retention. Notice that the BB is not just rolling down the barrel. You don't want this lip retention to be too tight. You don't want it to be too loose. I just had to give it a little push. You want some level of lip retention. Obviously, I can drop that BB down. Takes a light push. And now that's good to go. So now we can discuss the nub and the arm situation. So in order for Bull Gear to fix this design flaw in all these LMG hop-ups, to allow you to set your nub horizontally instead of vertically, this came with one drawback. That drawback is that while maintaining the profile that the hop-up chamber needs to be, you have very limited room to fit different kinds of nubs. So if I were to use a modified flat nub, I most definitely am going to find that when my hop is set to 0, it's still pressing down on that contact patch enough to overhop stuff. So what I found to work really well with these is to find a traditional cylindrical nub, find one that's small and squishy. Because of the shape of this arm, as that cylindrical nub starts to squish, it'll flatten itself out and it'll give you a good shape for your contact patch when doing an R-hop. In my experience, the cylindrical nubs that come with these EMG Atlas buckings are too big and too hard to give you that effect that I was just describing. So I always keep a stockpile of random old nubs sitting around. And what you'll see is, again, as this kind of flattens out, as this squishes, it's going to flatten out. And this tends to be the best bet we have without modifying this arm or making a custom arm and doing an M-nub. Because even if we did that, because of the angle that this is coming down at, and because of the profile and shape of this arm, modifying it yourself will likely result in you filing it and it being uneven, applying uneven hop tension, making BBs hook to the side. Or if you were to try to 3D print something like this that was flat for an M-nub, you're going to have a very thin portion over here that's probably going to flex and bend as you apply hop tension. Note that the hop-up chamber has a little notch in the middle to help keep the inner barrel centered. And I can apply some hop tension to this and you can see a nice flat contact surface, and this is about as extended as we're going to be able to get it. Is it the most ideal? No, but is it the best you're going to get when R-hopping one of these? Unfortunately, yes. I think more improvements can be made, but I have no issues with how these perform, and neither do my customers. Now note that this wheel is going to be really loose. This is true. It's going to be pretty loose. When this is pressed up against the feed block, it's going to help stiffen the wheel, and it's going to help maintain your adjustments. One thing you can do, if it's still very wobbly, is you can try to find an O-ring to replace this larger O-ring here that might be a little bit thicker, that might help stiffen up the play of the wheel. Now you got to be careful when doing that, because you don't want the O-ring to stick out so much that it's now acting as a shim that's not letting your hop-up chamber get as close as it needs to be. But this is one barrel down. I'm going to do this to 3 more, and we're going to move on. So with these hop-up barrel assemblies done, now we want to look at our gearbox shells that we're going to be pairing these with. And we want to just check a couple things to help ensure that we'll get good nozzle alignment. You also want to make sure that the inlet into the front of the shell is not too small. The wiggle room is not great, and there's not a whole lot you can really do to tune that. And the front face of this gearbox shell is not perfectly flat. So we really do have to trust the position of the shell in the receiver and the position that your outer barrel and the feed block is going to place this hop-up chamber, so that when these guys are pressed together, we don't have this alignment being all weird and cockeyed. Right now, we just kind of have to hope and trust that this won't present any issues. And when we get everything reassembled, we'll be checking that nozzle alignment, and we'll be making corrections as needed. And those little corrections might be kind of MacGyver-ish as far as how crafty we have to get to make that happen. But my next step is going to be getting this whole gearbox engine situation going on. So this is the end goal we're going after. We essentially want the engine to be braced so that it can't shift back and forth. And I'm using my F2 shim kit. I have a whole other video on that, but I'm positioning the engine so that my nozzle is not too shallow, thus not making an air seal. And also I don't want it to be going in too deep to where I might be over chambering the BB and giving myself some inconsistent head spacing. But the air seal here is checked out. The next thing I'm going for is I want to make sure that this trigger is actually engaging the micro switch on this trigger board. And in order to achieve that, I used a 3D printed shim that goes underneath the board. And this trigger is not shimmed, but on this guy over here, I did have to shim the trigger because tolerances. But I wanted to ensure that whether or not this trigger is tilting one way or the other, or whatever have you, it's always going to engage that switch, and the gun's always going to fire. I also did some cable management in the back, using a small zip tie to kind of fold up the excess FCU cable that we're not going to need. We really only need this much sticking out. And of course, I also had to install the braided line with the filtered fitting on it, and the number 14 nozzle. So let's check out those peculiarities on this third one here. I'm going to demonstrate how I got it to that point. I like to start by just changing the nozzle out. Now you don't want to just take out the old nozzle and put the new one in. And I'll also add that it's nice when you're doing this to a brand new engine. If the engine's well used and it's all dirty, my SOP is I'm going to completely disassemble this. I'm going to use the sonic cleaner, and I'm going to clean all of the metal components, obviously not the solenoids. And I'm going to be replacing all the O-rings and relubing everything. When we get a new nozzle, it's going to be completely dry. We're going to use Tech T to lubricate it. We really just want to lubricate this O-ring on the outside. We want to lubricate the bottom part here of the nozzle, because that's going to be riding on an O-ring. And then there's a small internal O-ring here, and I like to use a little brush to get in there. You could also use a Q-tip. And you really don't want an excess of this grease, Adding more is not gonna make things better. It's just gonna increase the chance that you'll be shooting that grease down into your inner barrel and causing some other issues. So that guy's gonna go right in there, and we can close this back up. Now, I mentioned before, I'm a big fan of the amped IGL braided lines and using the filtered fitting on it. The way these come, even if you buy it with the filtered fitting added to it, that filtered fitting is not going to be installed, so I'm going to show you how that installs. This is going to be on really tight. Don't just grab it by the line and try to twist it off, because you're going to kind of undo the connection there that's maintaining an air seal. Little needle nose pliers and a little combo wrench just to get it loose. And then once you break it loose, it's very easy to untwist now. But now we have this filtered fitting. It's going to come with 2 O-rings. The bigger O-ring is there to replace the O-ring that's right here. We don't really need that because this is a brand new line. We don't really have to replace that. But we have our fitting, so we're going to start by putting in the spring. And then we have this filter, and this is kind of like a cone. So it's going to go narrow side down onto the spring. You kind of have to finesse this part a little bit. That O-ring is supposed to, that little O-ring is supposed to rest right here. We just kind of want to get it on there. So now that that's on, we can screw it into the engine. Now the engine solenoid, the poppet solenoid down here, it kind of gets in the way of these IGLs sometimes. You kind of have to just get good. Sometimes it's going to be a little bit harder than others, because these are like hand crimped on, I believe. So you want to get it going. This is actually a really easy one. The other ones were way harder than this. Then I use a needle nose pliers to just torque it down. You don't have to like Hulk strength torque it down. Let's set that aside for now. I already put the FCU cable in. I like to very neatly bend it 90 degrees and kind of tuck it around that solenoid input. And I'm really careful not to pull the wires out of the connector itself, because that will create some issues. And now this is the most important part of this step. And this is the one thing I see get messed up all the time when not just featherweights, but any F2 build gets sent to me because it's not feeding. I don't trust my fallible human brain, so I leave myself a little note. In fact, I keep as many install manuals for electronics on hand as I possibly can, just to give myself reference, because again, I don't trust my fallible human brain. But you have a nozzle solenoid and you have a poppet solenoid. The FCU is going to allow you to tune the time duration that these are open. Those values are not the same. The adjustment is not happening in the same time increments. So you cannot swap these. You can't just put any of these in any of these ports. Now, I wrote this down myself, but if you go on Polarstar's website and you look at the Rev 3 FCU and the Polarstar F2 manuals, you'll see it referenced there. But we have the nozzle solenoid, which is the one on top if we're looking at it from the side. And then we have the poppet solenoid, which is down here. The nozzle solenoid is going to correspond with the J3. And the poppet solenoid is going to correspond with the J2. Do not get those mixed up, and double check that you got that right every time you install an F2. Trust me. Don't trust your fallible human brain, because we all brain fart, and you don't want a 2-second brain fart and the fact that you neglected to take an extra 2 seconds to check that you got it right to require you to have to take the entire gun apart again, because it's just a waste of time. that can easily be avoided. Not by being excellent, but by being disciplined enough to check yourself before you wreck yourself. So let's just double check. The upper solenoid, the nozzle solenoid, is going into J3, and my poppet solenoid is going into J2. There we go. Now, before I go bolting this down, I had mentioned the trigger earlier. If I just put this board down, what I was referring to earlier about the trigger switch was if I just put this trigger in right now, I can kind of exaggerate this for demo purposes while the shell is open. But it is possible that you can pull the trigger and not hit that switch. So you want to make sure that you are absolutely hitting that switch. Pretty much every featherweight I've worked on, that board is just going to be too low. So these 3D printed shims really come in handy. I much prefer to do this as opposed to gluing a bunch of stuff onto the trigger to extend its, to extend its contact surface. This 3D printed shim goes right there. The board goes right there. You can screw that down. And when I'm tucking these wires away, I always like to put the solenoid cables down first. And then I have this long FCU, which we're about to bunch up and zip tie to manage it in a second. And then I'll put the IGL above all of that. But before I do that, I'm going to use this F2 shim kit. Now, I already did the shimming off camera. I have a whole video showing how you would want to use the shim kit, but in the case of this build right here, I have a thick shim up front, and I have a thick and thin shim in the back. It's not always going to be the same because tolerances. Let's manage this cable a little bit. There's no need for it to have this much sticking out of the gun. It's just going to get in the way when you open your feed tray. So we're just going to fold it a couple times. And then I use a little zip tie. We're going to clip off the excess. And then I like to use the little channel provided by the Gearbox shell to kind of route these wires so that it comes out, and if it gets tugged on, it's not gonna get all this stuff all kerfuffled. Now, with that trigger in, we're just gonna quickly ensure that we're gonna figure out if I have to add any shims to this trigger or not. So we do have to use some screws to close the Gearbox shell. Very similar to shimming gears. We want to close this out so we know what our tolerances are. These 3 screws will be enough for now for me to just kind of check out the trigger. And I'm going to plug the FCU in, put a battery in, and I'm going to pull the trigger in many different ways, different angles. I'm going to intentionally try to miss the switch. What I want to see happen is that even when I try, I'm still hitting the switch. Okay, so we're firing. I like to press this switch to do it on full auto. Makes it a little bit easier to hear. But I'm going to tilt this up. There we go. We just missed the switch. If I stop tilting it, it works again. Now this is what I like to use rocket shims for shimming triggers. So I have it tilted and I kind of shifted it up towards the camera. And now I'm not engaging the switch still. But when I just simply tilt it, it's not as dramatic as it was before. Now, you know, if I were a lazy tech, I would just leave it the way it is and tell the customer, all right, you have to only pull the trigger this one specific way so that it fires. I don't like to do that. I like things to be easy. Let's try that again. The trigger is not sticky. And I'm really trying to miss the switch, but we're still hitting the switch. And it does look like if I added another shim, we would have a sticky trigger. So that is about good. And let's just double check that we still have a good air seal and that the nozzle is interacting with the bucking the way we want it to. You can't trust that it's always going to be the same. The gearbox shell will have tolerances, the nozzle will have some tolerances, albeit the nozzles will have tighter tolerances than probably any other part in this gun, because Polar Star does really precise work. But the hop-up chamber might have tolerances, the bucking might have tolerances, all that stuff. All right, so that makes an air seal. So these three hop-up barrel assembly and engine installs are done. Notice I'm keeping the hop-up barrel assembly corresponding to the same gearbox shell. I'm being really careful not to mix and match these because they are kind of shimmed out and tuned to one another. What's next? So with all those gearbox and engine situations taken care of, now we can really start talking about the feed block and the magazines that we're running for these featherweights. Now, keep in mind that you don't have to use the same box magazines that I'm running. This is where you kind of have a lot of leeway with the featherweight, partly due to the feed block allowing you to have some more versatility on the magazine front. But when using these Bull Gear kit box mags, they're not going to just drop in. If you watch the feed block install video, I do talk a lot about how the feed block can be messed with a little bit, mainly in terms of changing feed plates to get the most compatibility with whatever mag you choose to be running. So let's talk about these kit mags. So this is where we start to introduce this idea of a junction. Now, a junction is when you have a feed path, like a tube, right? This is the route the BB is going to take as it makes its way up into your hop-up chamber. A junction is any break, or I guess transition, from one feed hole into another. And pretty much with most LMG setups, you're going to have a lot more junctions than if you're dealing with just an M4. On an M4, your only real junction is from your magazine into your hop-up chamber. Now, looking at these kit box mags that we're running, if we open this up, BBs are going to make their way down into this feed gear. This is going to wind, and it's going to move BBs up into this feed tube. Now, this feed tube alone has a junction in it. You can see there's a split there. This is just part of this design. This was printed in multiple pieces. So right here is a junction. So we definitely want to make sure that like BBs can make it through that junction with no problem. And so far it appears like there's not really going to be a problem. And then our next junction is from this feed tube into the feed tube on the top of the mag. And then that feed tube on the top of the mag is going to make its way out through the top where we have this latch. And there's a junction between the bottom feed tube into the latch. And then from the top of the latch into the magwell adapter, which is then just a straight shot to the end, which then has another junction going into the feed plate, or the feed tube of the feed block. The feed block itself has a junction. And then out of the feed block, there's a junction between the feed block and your hop-up chamber. So that's a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 junctions. There's a lot. So understand that nothing is going to just drop in and be plug and play. Most of the emails I get after somebody buys a feed block, if they have some feeding issue, it's usually due to a junction, or it's because they didn't really pair an appropriate bucking with the hop-up chamber they're running, or they're running the stock hop-up chamber. So you're going to want to test the mag first. You want to make sure that the mag itself is actually going to be feeding. And then we have to take into consideration, how is all of this going to fit when it's actually on the gun? And will there be any disruptions to the junctions? We just have some BBs put in here. I have a battery plugged into the bottom of the box mag. And we can see there's no interruptions in feeding. The only reason why that wasn't like a steady flow is because I didn't put a lot of BBs in here and I kind of got to tilt it and rock it to get it in there. So far, this box mag on its own is fine. You might want to note how this fits. I can tell you for a fact, when I put this box on the receiver of the Featherweight, while this is in the mag well, these guys are going to fit more like this. They're not going to be very flush. So if I try to get that to feed again, it got caught. Now, what we can check for is, what if I just, yep, all I had to do is pull this latch back just a little bit to get it to feed. Now, if I pull it back too far, will it do the same thing? No. But when I release it, it will until I push it in all the way. So, what this is telling me is that there's a sweet spot here. Because this hole has to be perfectly centered over the hole underneath it. And if it's not, then it's going to disrupt the BBs. Now, I will say this. I got 8 of these mags in one order. One Bull Gear order. Every other mag is their updated design to this same exact mag. And you can see some of the differences, mainly in this latch. In this latch, if you pull this out all the way, it'll allow BBs through. Whereas this one it has to be a little bit more precise. So I'm probably going to modify this latch to make it more of an ellipse instead of a circle, so that even when it is pulled out all the way, it's actually going to let BBs pass. Much like this one. If we take a look at this one, this is one of the 3 in this batch that currently is running, no issues. I'm just going to show you the mods that I had to do to it, mainly the mag, to get that all situated. So first things first, this actual magwell adapter, the hole for the feed tube is slightly off center with the hole in the feed block. That is specific to this current batch of these Bull Gear mags. This doesn't really warrant me editing the design of the feed block, because then it would make it not so compatible with a bunch of other mags. Every time I place an order from Bull Gear, I'm getting something different. It's a different version of the same product. From their hop-up chambers to their magazines, Bull Gear is constantly updating stuff, sometimes to their benefit, sometimes to my detriment. In order to allow this to shift a little bit to the side, I did sand the flat surface of the magwell adapter so that this can kind of nudge over just a little bit. The next thing was actually a change I had to do to the feed block. And this is well within the SOP for the feed block. So let me show you this little drawing. This is kind of flipped. It should be like this. But this is our magwell adapter. And this is the feed plate for our feed block. My feed block comes with different feed plates in different lengths. I actually had to make some custom ones for this build. And I'm noticing that this is kind of becoming a trend with featherweights running these mags. So I might be including these custom feed plates in the future in the kit. This magazine only goes so far into the magwell. And then our feed plate is kind of fixed in position because it's constrained to the feed block itself. There's a tiny gap that exists here, this junction, where a BB can kind of get wedged off into the side, and now everything gets caught up. it'll get caught up because the BBs underneath are applying tension. And then this guy just gets stuck and it doesn't have anywhere to go. So by using a longer feed plate, like the 7mm long one, I'm increasing the length of the feed tube on the feed plate to reduce this gap to not allow this to be getting stuck like that. So that's what I had to do to this one, in addition to kind of shimming the position of the magwell adapter by sanding it. The next thing that I had to do was, we already demoed that these kit mags, if I just assemble them together like so, they'll feed fine. But when this box is actually inside the gun, you'll notice that it doesn't sit flush all the way. So we have a couple options here. The reason why it's not going in any further is because of this wall. Because of the dovetail and the dimensions of this mag, this will not be allowed to push in any further. What I could have done is I could have modded this flat surface to bring it down a little bit to allow the box mags to insert deeper, but I'm not a fan of that because we have 3 of these mags for this particular build and we want them to hot swap. And while I can modify this to account for the tolerances of this box, I don't know if it'll account for the tolerances of the other 2 boxes. So I find it's better to modify the actual magazine before we start modifying the gun. Because any changes I make to like the dovetail and how the mag actually fits, it could affect the compatibility of different types of mags should the end user want to try to use those down the road. What I could do instead is I can Dremel the flat surface here on the mag to make sure this inserts further. But this will create one other issue. There's a window here that the latch is going to actually catch onto. And if this just goes in deeper, I'm going to create more of a gap between this latch and the edge of this window. So if there's a gap there, that's going to allow this mag to kind of have some wiggle room to play, which means that when you physically push it in all the way, it'll feed, but if it somehow gets wiggled a little bit loose within that small tolerance due to that gap, then it's not going to feed, and the end user is constantly going to have to kind of press that mag into place to make sure everything's feeding, which is kind of annoying. So what I did instead was I actually glued a small piece of acrylic to this latch to ensure that even if the magazine isn't pushed in all the way, this latch will be pulled back far enough. And then to make sure that this hole is going to line up with this hole, I actually just reamed out the edge of it. I just extended it a little bit so that the box doesn't have to be inserted all the way for those BBs to make it through. And I did this to 2 out of these 3 featherweights so far, and every mag has been feeding without issues. So this is the approach I took to mod it. Whenever you do an LMG, regardless what mags you're going to run, don't be surprised if you have to do some crafty mods just to get everything to line up. It's all about making the junctions connect to one another so that you have a clear path for BBs to get through. After a long, painstaking process of sweatshop labor, I got all the adapters made up for all 3 of these featherweights. So here's the rundown. Briefly going over the power config. The idea is we want to power both the magazine and the gun off of a single battery. So what we're going to have is a single battery go into this parallel adapter. It can be a small HPA LiPo, or we can put an adapter on it so that we can run a larger 7.4 volt nunchuck LiPo, house that inside the feed tray, and we'll have a lot more capacity. It'll be nice to do that for longer events. Now coming out of here, we're going to power 2 things. We're going to power our FCU, and all this will be housed inside the gun. And then coming out of here is this connector. which will plug into the box mag via these bullet connectors. Very important that the red and black don't get mixed up. And then the power through the mag is going to make its way down here. There are some BBs in this mag. We have 2 connectors in the mag. All of this power is going to be going to here. But this connector is going to be what actually powers the box mag, which is why we have this bridge connection. So now with these connectors bridged, our power from the battery can power our FCU and also power all the way through here, out the Deans, and into the box mag. Every single one of the box mags for these builds have a bridge for it. That way he doesn't have to put a battery, or they, because there's 3 customers here, they don't have to put a battery in every single mag. 2 of these featherweights have 3 mags and one of them has 2 mags. And the idea is they all want to be able to hot swap them. And I just want to show off those connections I was talking about. Currently the engine and the magazine are going to run off of a single battery. Up top here we have this Deans to JST, so we can use a larger nunchuck 7.4. It'll actually lay down right here underneath the feed track, and we'll be able to close everything just fine. That'll give you a lot of capacity. Or this can just be removed, and we can use one of these small JST lipos. We can see that our engine is on because we have this parallel circuit. One out is going into the FCU, and the other out is going into the box mag. From this magwell adapter with that yellow XT connector, it's going down into the mag. Let's flip this upside down. So that power is coming out of this Dean connector, and we're sending it right back in to the box mag directly using this little bridge adapter. So with that battery plugged in up top here, we can wind our mag. And I have it on semi-auto right now, but we can power both with one battery. And this is very advantageous because if we have 3 of these boxes and we want to hot swap it, it's a lot cheaper to just have one battery up here than to have one battery for each mag. One other mod that was done was because of the position of the cutout in my feed block to allow wires to pass, these wires coming out of the middle, it kind of forces it to kind of bend and push up against the feed block. So by just cutting a little notch out of this plate up top here, I can better route these towards the corner where that window is. And it just kind of helps keep the wire routing a little bit neater. This is a little bonus part of the video where I talk about, those little optional tidbits. So this one is definitely different from the previous one you saw in the other shot. This one was not originally a Mark 48. We actually got the top part of the handguard aftermarket. This one's actually metal, unlike the, the featherweight Mark 46 handguard. And then this had the carry handle on it, and we cut that off, cleaned this guy up on the lathe, and you would never guess that there was a carry handle there. There's a suppressor on there. I'll note with the featherweight, if you want to add muzzle attachments to it, you are going to have to remove that dial for the mock adjustable gas block, and that'll let you put your attachments on there flush. It's just a single grub screw going through a piece of plastic. You loosen that, it comes out. You might lose some of the aesthetic, but when you're doing cursed mods like this, it doesn't really matter too much. This is a AntTech Picatinny stock adapter for the featherweight. It's 3D printed. It's 3 main pieces. We have the bracket for mounting, we have the main body, and we have the rail segment. And all these guys are held together with a hex nut and bolts going through it. And it's very sturdy. And then this is the Laylax folding stock. We could put any Picatinny mounted stock on this now, which is kind of nice. We went for the dip visor because it's extra cursed, but also because this player is going to be wearing a full face mask, so this will actually make it easier for him to you know, not need a cheek weld. So changing like outer barrels, you know, that's a thing that can be done. To circle back to something I think I briefly talked about with the featherweight feed block install, is if you have a normal A&K or classic Army spec outer barrel, that will fit onto this with no problems. You might have to adjust where that gas block knob portion might insert into the hole here. That might have to be modded a little bit depending on which outer barrel you have. There's a couple different versions if you're looking at that A&K classic Army spec. And then you'll have to use a different hop-up chamber. You'll have to use the A&K classic Army spec hop-up chamber if you're going to use those outer barrels. And the feed block does come with the extension to let this hop-up chamber be long and compatible with the featherweight. And while working on all these featherweights, I took a stab at mine again. I'll point out some key differences in mine. I have the Picatinny stock on it because it's cursed. I love it. I have, like, I think an Airsoft Artisan version of this visor stock. It's a little bit too long. It does not let me fold it all the way. I don't really care. But I chopped the outer barrel down. It's like a 9-inch outer barrel, which you almost can't really appreciate until you take it out of the gun and hold it. Like, this thing is tiny. And the handguard was also chopped. So, like, those types of creative mods, you have a lot of freedom with, as long as you have the tools and the know-how to execute it right. And then the F2 that I have in mine is actually using the Gate Titan 2 trigger board instead of the Polar Star version 2 trigger board and the Polar Star FCU. So I can actually program this on my phone via Bluetooth through this Gate Titan app. This is something I'm playing with. I don't know if I necessarily recommend this. It's definitely more expensive to add this onto your gun than to just stick with what the Polar Star F2 is going to come with. It's not super necessary. And I am in the shadows prototyping out a selector switch for this. I would like this to be select fire, but I don't want some like rinky-dinky selector switch on it. I want it to look like if FN Hersel made the M249 select fire, what would that switch look like? So that's the thought that I'm putting into it. But you have these options. Another notable difference with mine is I didn't R-hop it, and I don't have a PDI barrel. I have a Lambda barrel, and I'm using a True Hop. I'm using the True Hop bucking, mainly just to test it out, but I think it performs great. I could go either way. In this case, R-hop it or use a True Hop. I think a True Hop's a little bit easier. I don't know how durable they are over time. I can attest to the lifespan of the R-hop patches that I install. But yeah, just, you know, you can have a lot of fun with these featherweights. I like building them. They're super lightweight. You can make them very cursed, and they're just, you know, there's a lot of potential for these cheap guns to be made very unique. So that's 3 successful featherweight builds down. And, you know, feel free to tell me your experiences with building featherweights in the comments. Tell me I'm wrong. I know you love to tell me I'm wrong and how, you know, you're a better tech. I love those comments. I'm not making any money on these videos. This is just for fun, okay? This is for the guys that don't know what the hell they're walking into when they buy one of these guns. Anyway, I appreciate those comments. I appreciate you guys for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, do all that good stuff. But yeah, with all that said, good night, God bless, I'm out.
Yeah. Semester's over in 4 weeks. So.
We're hitting UASC over there in the background. That's like 700 yards. I can hit a soda can at 700 yards with the 22. I'm more impressed with the field, but the gun's good too.